It's in times of chaos that the character of God is on full display. We don't often think about hope when everything is going well. We need hope at all times, but specifically we need to focus on the hope that we have during times of chaos. We come to the book of Ruth, and I realize there's a lot of confusion on how to read the Old Testament and how to understand the role that people in the Old Testament played. More often than not, we're told to go and study them as a character study. I'm going to push back against that. The Old Testament, like all of the Bibles, about God. It's the revelation of God to us. It's telling us about God's character, His person, His faithfulness, the hope that that faithfulness provides for us. And so as we come into the book of Ruth, the first thing I want to ask is, and challenge you to think about, is who's the book about? I mean, this is the only book in the Old Testament named for a non-Israelite. Ruth's a Moabite. The book's named after her. That should cause us to start asking some questions. You know, it's not uncommon, though, to read a story or watch a movie where the main character kind of takes a back seat to someone else who you think is the main character. Let me challenge you real quick on just a few movies maybe that you've heard of. For example, The Return of the Jedi. You wouldn't think of Princess Leia as the main protagonist or the main character, but if you watch the movie, she actually is. How about this? Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I know you thought it was about Charlie. It's not. It's about Willie. And let me go a little step further. I'm going to nerd out for just a minute. How about Lord of the Rings? How many of you thought of Samwise as the main protagonist? Go watch it again. Think through it. And let me go a step farther for some of my sci-fi folks. How about The Matrix? I know that you thought Neo was the main character the whole time, but no, I think it was Morpheus. The others of you are like, I've never seen any of that. Preacher, please get back to the book of Ruth. Well, I've made a point. It's not about Ruth. That's my point. I think Ruth plays a significant role in the story, very important role. But this book could have very easily been called the book of Naomi, the book of Boaz, but for some reason it's called the book of Ruth. Now, when we read through the book, it's actually a short book, only 4 chapters. You'll notice about half of the words in the book are dialogue. That is someone speaking, their direct speech. Now, of all the direct speech that encompasses about half of the book, of the 3 main characters, Ruth speaks the least. Interesting. We find both Naomi and Boaz speaking more than Ruth. Furthermore, if we read the opening and the closing of the book, I don't know, that's really how we're supposed to read stories. The opening gets your attention, the conclusion wraps it all up. That's what we see here, crisis, resolution. Well, when you open it up, who's it about? Naomi. I mean, in fact, we have Elimelech being referred to as her husband. The emphasis is clearly on Naomi in the beginning and clearly on Naomi in the end. Some have referred to her as the female Job. Think about the story of Job for just a moment. Now, many say the book of Job is about Job's suffering. It's actually about God's divine sovereignty and divine preservation. But let us think of it on a human level for just a moment. Job loses everything in the beginning. In the end, he's restored twofold. The beginning of the story, Naomi loses everything, but in the end, she regains even more. Also, think about Boaz's role. Boaz is the one who redeems Naomi and Ruth, redeeming Naomi's property and Ruth becoming his wife through it. I mean, he's the one who shows compassion, mercy, courage. He's the one who steps forward, does the right thing, the noble man doing what the other wouldn't. As we'll see as we read through the book, he wasn't even first in line. There was another, quote-unquote, redeemer who said, yeah, of course I'll take the land. You got to admit, this man must have been a capitalist. He saw land, he saw a deal. I'll take it. Oh, by the way, there's a second wife. My wife would say, you're not getting the land. You know what I mean? So anyway, apparently his wife said the same thing. You're not getting the land. That's how I knew they were Baptists in the Old Testament. Anyway, so I digress. So Boaz steps up, does the right thing. Says, yes, I'll redeem the land, marries Ruth. Beautiful picture. So We call it, though, the story of Ruth, as if she's the main character. And as we'll see, she's not. Instead, we see she's the link. She connects Naomi to Boaz. Her role is a linking role, is to connect these two individuals. Here's what we need to understand as we see this link, as we see what's happening here, is we need to recognize that the events are more important than the characters. For some of you, that's unsettling because we've only been taught to read the Bible as if we need to focus on these characters and we don't really understand the events that are playing out. The characters are a means to communicate how these events are unfolding as part of God's divine plan. The real issue here is divine providence. That is to remind us that God is in control at all times. Because if we remember how this text opens up in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, in the days of the judges. Now, if you need a reminder of how bad things can get when there is no king in Israel and every man does what is right in his own eyes, you think it's bad now, just go back and read. You will see how bad things can get. In those days, in the midst of pure and utter chaos, in the midst of apostasy and injustice and oppression, here's this family. Seemingly nobodies. And a Moabite. Now you're reading the story like, that is so beautiful. Oh, I love a good love story. Guys are like, can we go back to some of the good stuff? Women love this story. It's a beautiful love story. Oh, look at this. You need to understand how the original audience would have been shocked to read this story. A non-Israelite becomes the link that God uses to demonstrate his faithfulness. Because what we're missing here, and we need to understand, is when we go back and we understand what's been unfolding, we'll see this is theology in living color. It's not abstract anymore. We're seeing it on display. You've just read Judges 17 through 21. You hear 4 times, because there's no king, everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. The book that follows Ruth is the beginning of the monarchy. It's the link. The last chapter here will give us the genealogy of the coming king. It's announcing in the midst of this chaos that God is still divinely working, even if ever so quietly, and even outside of Israel. He's still working to bring about his perfect plan and his perfect will. We're reminded when it appears that the world is in the throes of utter chaos, God is still at work, even if ever so quietly. Even working through and in unlikely people, unexpected people, in remote places. The original reader would have been shocked. Been shocked at quite a few things, but certainly shocked that it was a Moabite. But see, what I need to remind you of is that this story isn't meant to be read in isolation. We're not to simply study Ruth, to study it in and of itself. It's part of a divine scheme that's unfolding. We can't appreciate Ruth if we don't see what's just happened in Judges and understand what's unfolding in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Samuel would be known as 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Kings would have been known as 3rd and 4th Kings. And so it ushers us into the monarchy. So the reader would have recognized here the role that this is playing. Now, it's interesting, though. In this book, we have no miracles, no divine visitations, no prophetic revelation. We just have a simple story. Some believe that God is only working in the sensational. The more sensational, the more God must be in it. But we're reminded that, wait a minute, here's a simple family. And in fact, in some respects, maybe even living in disobedience. But God has this one person to link these people to bring about his will that would ultimately bring about his promised king. That's amazing. God truly is working all things together for what? His glory and our good. This story is a reminder of that as we see this unfolding. What we have here, though, is a mini crisis. Now, I know that every crisis in my mind that happens in my family is a major crisis. That is because it's happening in my life and my family. It's significant. Because I'm an A-type, I don't like crisis. I like resolution. There's a secret, though, about A-types, and they won't tell you this. They actually love crisis because they love to be the one resolving crises. And so they always complain about them, but they actually love them. Anyway, for those A-types in here, you know what I'm talking about. But a little mini crisis. Now, this mini crisis is playing out in the midst of really what we would say is a regional or national crisis. There's a famine in the land. And Elimelech, whose name means my God is king, they named their children something that profess faith. And so here his name means basically that Elohim, or God, is king. He's the only king. He's the one who provides. He's the sovereign. And then you see him moving out of Israel. Why? Because there's a famine. And so there's somewhat an irony here, isn't there? Isn't it ironic? My name means that God's in control. But I don't believe him. And then Bethlehem. It means house of bread. In the house of bread, there's a famine. The irony is thick. But I want you to note, too, the role that Bethlehem will play in setting the stage for 1 Samuel. Because we've just noted in Judges 17 through 21, there were 2 cities mentioned. Now I want to challenge you to go back and read those chapters. Now I'm going to warn you, this isn't the stuff you read to your kids at night. This is some horrific stuff happening in those chapters. But you saw 2 cities, Bethlehem and Gibeah. It's interesting because everything good happens in Bethlehem. They're nice, they receive the guests, the visitors. But then you go to Gibeah, and it's horrific what happens. The violence, the immorality is such that I cannot mention it right now because we have children in the worship gathering. When you go into Samuel, see 2 kings, Saul and David. Well, we know David's city was what? Bethlehem. Where was Saul from? Gibeah. The groundwork's being laid. There's a rightful king. Saul was the one the people wanted. He was, if you will, head and shoulders above everybody else. He would have been the tall, strapping one. And David is the short, ruddy one. When they come looking for a king in Jesse's house, he's out in the field. They don't even bring him in for the lineup. I mean, you get a call from somebody saying, hey, one of your children are going to be chosen to be king. I've got all these sons. Let me line them up. And Samuel says, well, it's not one of these. Oh, that's right. I've got one in the field. Didn't think he'd be the one. Isn't that like you, Lord, though? God is working in ways that we don't understand because we think that he should look as we look upon people, saying, there's the ideal person. But yet what God does is he chooses the unlikely to demonstrate his faithfulness. That's what we see in this book. That's the link. That's the crisis. But I want to show you something, though, as you think about this crisis, is there's a divine agenda here. And I don't want you to miss it. Now, some of you are like, this is the preeminent love story in the Bible. And I'm like, is it? Is that what this is? Is God just giving us a text so we can read at weddings? Is that what Ruth is? Is it just meant to be a sappy love story, hopeless romantic? No. And yes. No, in the way that we've portrayed it. I'm actually feeling a little nauseous now, even thinking about it. But on the other hand, it is yes. That is, if you're talking about God's love, God's covenantal love, God's promises and faithfulness to his people. There's a divine agenda here. And let me help you with it. The whole goal is to get Ruth to Bethlehem. That's the divine agenda. Everything that's playing out in this story is to get Ruth, the Moabite, to Bethlehem. Now, I realize some of us struggle with divine sovereignty. We struggle with the fact of divine providence. And we read this story and we say, well, look at the things that unfolded to get Ruth there. We are troubled by that, aren't we? We should be. The things of God aren't meant to just be set aside and say, well, I completely understand. If you completely understand everything about God, I'm certain that you don't understand God, because God is certainly going to be far greater, immensely wiser than anyone can possibly imagine. The divine agenda is very clear. It is to get Ruth to Bethlehem and to Boaz. God's not the author of sin. He's not the instigator of Elimelech's unfaithfulness, but he uses it. You want to talk about divine sovereignty? That's divine sovereignty. When God can, if you will, permit for his perfect will something to unfold to bring about his perfect will, in that his restoration of a people, his divine providence on display in preserving a people and ultimately saving a people. Because the only other time that Ruth's name is mentioned in the Bible outside this book is Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. Matthew, in the genealogy of Jesus, wants to point out to us several non-Israelite women. And he's reminding us that flowing in the very blood of David was Moabite blood. And flowing in the body of Jesus and in his natural body, in his blood, was the blood of Gentiles. And you say, why does that matter? Because Matthew closes his gospel on that same theme, saying, go to the nations and make disciples. God had a divine agenda in getting Ruth to Bethlehem. Now I recognize that hearing that makes us uncomfortable. We'd like to just focus on the love story part and forget about the providence part. But we don't understand love until we've understood providence. I want you to understand that for your salvation, God was moving heaven and earth. He was moving and shaping circumstances and people long before you were even born or even thought of. To bring about your salvation, God was orchestrating events, moving people hundreds, thousands of years before we were even born. That's a beautiful love story. But as we read through the story, we recognize in this mini crisis, the Elimelech, he dies. This is unfortunate. Naomi's now going to be a widow. What will she do? How will she take care of herself? She's not with her family, that is her extended family. She's in a foreign land, but she's got her 2 sons. And the way it would have worked is the sons would have taken care of their mother. Now, the narrator doesn't say a whole lot about this. In fact, just says it in passing that the sons marry Moabites. That would have been peculiar for the original audience. It would have been strange to them. But the narrator really doesn't emphasize it beyond just stating it as fact. It's almost like it's implied that this is a problem. But then notice how long they're there. 10 years. No sons. That's interesting because the whole book's about progeny. That is, it's about genealogy. It's about ancestry. It ends with a genealogical table. It's all about, in their mind, to live on was to have sons, to have children. This is how you lived on. And the author is clear, after 10 years, no grandchildren. Now, in the ancient Near East, it was automatic. Then the woman was barren. Well, clearly that's not the case here. Ruth gets married and has a son. That's just biology for everybody so that you understand that. She wasn't. The sons were more than likely the ones who were sterile here. Now, in the ancient Near East, you can't come out and say that. I mean, you just can't just say that. But it's being implied here when you follow the story. The narrator wants to see the family's decimated. In their mind, the original audience would have heard this story, and at this point, it's over. They're decimated. Their line has ended. Everything's done. There's no hope. The future is not bright for Naomi. That's why she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, which means pleasant. Call me bitter. You're getting on her like, listen, you don't have any faith, Naomi. Well, I don't know that you've walked where Naomi's walked. I tell you what, when you're looking at your family decimated and in total despair, then you stand around and say, I'm pleasant. And then we'll believe that you can criticize Naomi. But if you're like me, we get a little scratch, and next thing you know, we're crying. Why me? I certainly can understand. This is why we don't do character studies like what's going on in her mind, the psychology of bitterness. That's not the point. The point is the family's completely decimated. The original reader would have recognized that there's no hope. The future's not bright. It's bleak. But wait a minute. If you know the God of the story, the future's bright. He specializes in the impossible. Miracles aren't really miracles for God. They're just God acting. I mean, it's going to take a miracle, is it not? Naomi's given up. Go back. It's over. The family's decimated. She's ready just to write it all off. There's no hope. Some of us are told if your faith wavers, then God won't deliver you. And I want to help you. God specializes in delivering those of little faith. If not, you wouldn't be sitting here today. You would not be here. I would not be here. I can stand up here and pretend like I've had just a super amount of faith all the time, and I've always believed, and I've always persevered by my own willpower, but that's not true. I've been divinely preserved by the Holy Spirit of God through the most difficult seasons of my life. Even when it feels like it's bleak, that Holy Spirit, that still small voice reminds me, look at the faithfulness of God on display in His Word. When they thought it was bleak, the future was actually bright. And I want to remind you today, look around. You might feel that it's bleak for us, that it's bleak for our country, for the church, for Christianity. But I want to remind you that with Christ, the future is bright. That will never change. The future remains bright because Christ remains on the throne. Let us testify to that, church. I don't know that it could have been any worse. That's what the narrator wants you to see. It couldn't have been any worse. She's in a foreign land. Husband dead. Son's dead. No grandson. Line is cut off. They have nothing. She tells the daughter-in-laws, go home. Good luck. She's given up hope. Well, if God thought like us, we'd write her off. Well, yeah, you weren't very faithful. Good luck. But isn't that just like you, Lord? To see us in those times of despair, in our brokenness, when we've given up hope, and yet you show your grace in those moments to us? The faithless, the hopeless find grace. Who would have thought it? But when we read this story, it's a visible, tangible reminder that that's exactly how God works. Family is decimated, husband dead, son sterile, no offspring. All hope is gone. And I want to add this. She's going back to a land that's filled with apostasy. Remind you of the book of Judges. That's the day in which she lives. A land filled with injustice. A land filled with idolatry and evil. You girls stay behind. I'm going home. I heard there's some bread again, but that's momentary, isn't it? I think the revival of the crops and the harvest was to bring Ruth back. But before we go any farther, I want to remind you that there is a real hero of the story. Although he's not mentioned as the hero, there's absolutely no doubt who the hero of this story is. It's not Naomi. She's given up hope, though I think she's the center of the story. I think she is the main character. It's not Ruth. Not even Boaz, the one who redeems. The real hero is the hero of every story in the Bible, and it's God. That's the real hero. Who would have thought that when the world goes crazy around you, when it appears that there's no hope, that the future is bleak, that despair is set in, that what we love has been decimated, that there would be hope? Oh, it feels silly to pronounce such a thing, doesn't it? It almost feels ridiculous to make such claims in the face of such hostility and apostasy and idolatry. Who would have thought there could be such a revival of the worship of the God Almighty of the Bible? Many of us have just thrown in the towel. Longing for the return of Christ, nothing wrong with longing for the return of Christ. Continue to long for that, church. But we've written off even the possibility there could be a revival or an awakening amongst our people. God's still the hero. Still the hero today. God is still saving people. He's still opening up hearts and minds to the truth of the gospel, even right now. Who would have thought it? People are still being saved. Lives are still being changed. And God is still the hero. Remember where I opened, I mentioned that some of the movies and some of the stories that you've read, the hero kind of takes a back seat and you've got to go watch it again. Some of you are going home today and you're going to binge watch Star Wars to see if I was right. I said Return of the Jedi, one episode. And so some of you are going to go and challenge me on this. Maybe you'll watch Charlie and the Chocolate Factory one more time. I don't know. I'm talking about the old one, not the new one. I'm talking about the old. Watch the old one. I digress. But I want you to go back and read the book of Ruth again. Because unfortunately, in our character study model of reading the Bible, the main hero has been pushed into a back seat. Go back and reread it. I read it this week to see how long it would take me. It took me about 13 and a half minutes, so you can do it probably at least 20, 25 if you're reading slow. Recognizing who the real hero is. I promise you the story will come alive. You'll see God's hand in ways that you didn't see it before, and by His grace, you will see His hand working in your life in ways you never thought possible. Let us pray. Father, I